So far this year on Zilog and Moto, I've reviewed a few sports titles, an action platformer, a full-motion video light gun game, and whatever the hell Balljacks is. In the spreadsheet that I use to keep track of what I've reviewed when, I've got Balljacks listed as a puzzle game, and while that's not right, other places on the internet have it listed as a sports title, and that's not quite right either. Maybe I should just create a new genre called Terrible and throw all of the one-star and below games in it, because clearly they have all failed at whatever they were supposed to be. Anyway, regardless of that, a genre that we haven't touched on yet so far this year is one that was definitely my favorite genre of video game growing up, especially with its presence in the arcades at the time, and it's one that I still enjoy quite a bit, and that is the beat 'em up. So, when I had an open spot in the review schedule this week, I decided to slot one in the mix to change things up a bit. Let's be honest, if I'd reviewed another sports game this week, I think someone at YouTube might have initiated a welfare check on me, as that could have been construed as a cry for help. With the beat 'em up genre decided on, now it was time to determine what game to choose. Well, the remaining Golden Axe and Streets of Rage games are spoken for and on the schedule already, and I've already looked at certain legendary titles like DJ Boy and Coffee Crisis, so what does that leave? Alien Storm, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Hyperstone Heist? Or maybe go back to where it all began for so many people and finally start on the Double Dragon series, seeing as how I've still got 5 of those to review. Well, while those are all good choices, I think this week we're going to try something completely different. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are thoroughly confused at the existence of a game called Coffee Crisis. Yes, it's real. I unfortunately reviewed it back in episode 89. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel that dares to suggest maybe a coffee house shouldn't try to make a video game about itself. Although I suppose a Dunkin' Donuts game couldn't be any worse than its coffee. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. One thing about mentioning Coffee Crisis there is that this library of games that I'm curating for Zilog and Moto does include certain unlicensed titles, whether they were unlicensed titles from the original run of the console, or like Coffee Crisis, they were titles that were released after the fact. For today's review, Generals of the Yang family, it actually falls into both categories. This copy that I'm reviewing today was picked up by Pico Interactive in the United States and Pixel Heart in Europe and released back in 2017. However, it actually dates back to 1993, where the original version of the game was developed by Gamtech in Taiwan. Previously, I reviewed a similarly released effort when I looked at Water Margin, A Tale of Clouds and Wind in episode 135, and it ended up being a surprisingly good game, although with some clearly questionable programming choices that line up with it being an unlicensed title. So does Generals of the Yang family bring some of that same surprisingly good beat-em-up action to the table, or is this a game that probably could have been left in Asia? We'll try to answer that, but first, a look at this brand new package. I mentioned that this copy of Generals of the Yang family is brand new, and that's true because this game literally sat on my shelf for the last 5 or so years sealed until this last week when I opened it up for playing and reviewing it this week. And because of that, it's minty fresh with not even any dust on it. As mentioned, Pico Interactive originally published this game in 2017, but if you check their site, it's no longer for sale, and I can only assume it's because Pico probably sold out of however many they produced years ago and weren't selling enough copies to merit reprinting it. Also, apparently Duke Nukem 3D is no longer available from Pico either, but in the case of Duke, absolutely nothing of value was lost, and they're honestly probably doing people a favor by not selling that abhorrent piece of trash anymore. Having said all that, if after watching this review you decide you want a copy for yourself, The Pico Interactive version still pops up on eBay from time to time, and Pixel Heart still has the European version for sale on their site, at least as of recording of this video in early 2025, with both options running about $50 or so. Also, apparently both copies of the game utilize the same ROM, so no matter which version you pick up, you can be confident that it's going to function in the same manner. As far as this version of the game goes, I like that Pico Interactive went with the black cross-hatching format of the early Genesis and Mega Drive library, and while it doesn't look exactly like an officially licensed title, it's at least close. The art style is solid and clearly anime influenced, however, having the title of the game just shunted down into the lower left corner looks a bit weird, especially for a game where it's already somewhat confusing if it should be referred to as Generals of the Yang Family Clan of Heroes, or Clan of Heroes, Generals of the Yang Family. They really probably should have swapped the positions and size of the title with the Pico logo. On the other hand, here's what Pixel Heart came up with for the European version, and even though it doesn't have the classic formatting, to me this is clearly the better cover. But I could see that coming down to personal preference. In my opinion, the Pixel Heart version's art has a slightly more classy style to it, the logo has a more appropriate positioning at the top, and it gets the title right, so there's no confusion about which part should go first. Flipping over to the back of my copy, Pico continues with the classic Genesis formatting with a large screenshot at the top, followed by two more below, all with rounded corners to appear as if taken from an old CRT. Over to the right, there's some decent flavor text hyping the game up, but down at the bottom, Yang Warrior Family for you, Genesis console. I mean, come on, if this game was going to get sold for full price, couldn't they at least have proofread the cover? Opening up the package, and there's the cartridge and manual. The manual isn't very long, with only 8 pages of instruction, but one nice thing about these aftermarket releases is that they were able to print the manuals as full color, and there was clearly some effort into putting the graphic design together for this. Also, having said that, on the first page there's yet another typo, as the game is referred to as not Clan of Heroes, but Clan of Warriors, not once but twice. Not installing a lot of confidence for the rest of the game here, but if I'm being honest, it wouldn't be the first title that I've played where it was still a good game despite some fairly obvious translation issues. Okay, that's the package. Let's boot up Generals of the Yang Family and see if this is a game that deserves to be on your shelves, or if it should be relegated to history just like the game's subject matter. Generals of the Yang Family is a video game based on various folklore surrounding the Song dynasty in China, which existed for about 300 years from 960 AD to 1279. While there's some truth in the various plays and books that fall under the General of the Yang Family heading, for the most part they're a fictional look into the life of Yang Yi, a military general, and his family as they fought against the neighboring dynasties in China. I mentioned Water Margin earlier, and if you saw that review, or are simply familiar with that game or story, you might think that this sounds pretty familiar, and for good reason, because Water Margin is based on a similar set of stories and folklore, just set later on in the history of China. Character Yang Zi from Water Margin is actually a descendant of the Yang family, giving both stories a very real connection, rather than just being set in the same country in a similar time period. I mean, as real a connection as any fictional character can have to another fictional character, but you get the idea. For the video game, the developers chose to focus on 4 main characters: Yang Yi, the patriarch of the family; Yang Liulang, aka Yang Zhao, Yang Yi's 6th child; Yang Zongbao, Yang Liulang's son and Yang Yi's grandson; and Mu Yuyang, Yang Zongbao's wife and an accomplished warrior in her own right. If you're getting the image of a feudal Chinese soap opera, you're not far off, as the stories of the Generals of the Yang family have even more characters, as Yang Yi had a lot of kids and grandkids. Also, this is far more research about China in the Middle Ages than I was planning on doing this week. You'd think I was reviewing Romance of Three Kingdoms or something. With 4 main characters to choose from, the developers made the sensible choice to have each character have different strengths and weaknesses, similar to other post-Double Dragon beat-em-ups. Yang Yi physically looks the oldest of any of the characters, which makes sense due to him being the patriarch of the family, and is equipped with a naginata, giving him the longest range of any of the characters. Yang Lulang is the bruiser of the group and doesn't utilize a weapon, instead relying on his bare fists. He's the strongest, slowest character, and that lack of speed will ultimately be an issue, as I'll get to in a minute. Yang Zongbao fights with a sword, somewhat reminiscent of the fighters in Capcom's Knights of the Round, and his strength is on par with Yang Yi's. However, he trades reach for speed. And finally, rounding out the group is Mu Guying, who dual wields daggers and is the fastest character, just slightly faster than Yang Zongbao, but also slightly weaker. The manual mentions that Mu might be the most difficult to play as due to the lack of physical strength in her character, but based on my experience, I'd say that Yang Lulang is actually the most difficult to play as due to some quirks with how the game works. Since Yang Lulang is the slowest character and has the shortest reach, you're going to have to be up close and personal with the enemies, especially bosses. This is a problem because even though he's essentially the tank character, he doesn't take damage any better than anyone else. Or if he does, it's such a small amount that it feels like all characters take the same amount when they get hit. Also, the same can be said for dishing out damage. Even though Lulang is supposed to be the big tough guy, it doesn't really seem like he does any more damage than anyone else, as hits from everyone appear to all take the same small chunks from enemy life bars. So, with there being no physical advantage in strength or speed, you can see why taking the slowest character with the shortest range might be a bit of a problem. Putting Lulang aside, you're then left with Yang Yi, Zongbao, and Mu, and honestly, at that point, it kind of comes down to a personal preference as to who to choose. Do you want to go with the reach advantage that Yang Yi has, or the speed advantage of the other two? I tend to lean towards Zongbao myself, as having that extra speed is pretty helpful when most of the game involves mobs coming from both sides of the screen. And while the extra reach of the naginata is nice, the combos take longer to finish, meaning that if you're not careful, you're going to leave yourself open to an enemy sneaking in and getting a hit. Aside from just hammering on the B button to get combos out, you also have a few other options for attacks. If you get up close to an enemy, you can clinch and throw either to the left or the right. However, it should be pointed out that each of the four characters has the exact same throw that does the same damage, regardless of if you're playing as Mu or Lulang. There's no clinch combos or variations if you grab them from in front or behind, and no combining clinching with jumping or vaulting. Either you throw them to the left or to the right, essentially turning the maneuver into just pure crowd control and a way to keep enemies on one side of the screen or the other. While I appreciate at least including the throws and the fact that enemies can be thrown into one another, the limited options here doesn't help the simplistic feel of combat. Outside of the clinches and combos, there's two other attacks available. Players can either attempt jump kicks, either straight up in the air or moving left or right, or each player has a special attack that can be triggered by the A button. The jump kicks work okay, but due to the fact that all of the enemies that you'll be facing are ground-based, and the fact that they don't do much damage, there's really not much of a reason to use them instead of standard combos. And to be honest, while they're functional, the timing on them feels a little bit clumsy. As far as the special attacks go, they look cool, with each player having their own specials, but just like the jump kicks, you're probably not going to use them for the most part in combat, due to the fact that just like the throws, they're really just there for crowd control, and they don't do a whole lot of damage. And then there's the double whammy of, since you're going to use up health to pull off a special attack, you probably would have just lost that same amount of health from an enemy if you had just let them attack you in the first place, or maybe even less. Like most beat-em-ups, there's items that can be picked up as you go along by breaking things. However, there's not a whole lot of variety here, with just a few food items for health, and then 2 items to add points to your score. No extra lives, continues, and no weapons. I'm assuming because 3 of the 4 characters already carry their own. Like the rest of the game, it just feels simple, and I question what even the point is of having a scoring system is at all, because you can't earn extra lives by getting a certain score, and there's no entering in your initials as far as a high score screen goes. And to top it all off, in one of the stranger quirks of the game, and something that I don't think I've ever seen in any other beat 'em up, enemies will attack those same vases and barrels as soon as they come on the screen instead of you. It doesn't really affect anything because you would have just destroyed the vases anyway to get what's hiding inside them, and then the items don't disappear if you don't grab them right away, but it's just super strange to see. In the brief write-up of the game on Sega Retro, it mentioned that when Pico Interactive translated the game for release, they also fixed certain bugs related to gameplay, but this is clearly one that they missed. I mentioned that you can't earn or pick up any extra lives or continues as you play, so since that's all you get, you better make them last. The game has 6 levels, with the first 4 containing a main area and a boss section, and then levels 5 and 6 having 2 areas before a boss. So on the whole, there's a decent amount of gameplay to get through, with a full playthrough taking around an hour or so. The game has 2 difficulty levels, easy and hard, which is apparently one of the things that was added by Pico in this version of the game, but even the easy difficulty is going to be a bit tough to get through in single player mode due to limited continues. If the game was structured like other beat 'em ups, where you could get extra lives, I'd say the difficulty level, at least in easy mode, is pretty good. But without that, even good beat 'em up players are probably going to struggle to get through the game without cheating via the level select code, or the old put the controller in the second port when you run out of continues on first player trick. From a graphics perspective, on first glance, I was very impressed due to the sheer size of the characters. Comparing the sprites used here versus something like Streets of Rage or Growl, and the difference is night and day, with the larger sprites giving Generals of the Yang family a look closer to the arcade version of Final Fight. However, as impressive as those large sprites are, size is not everything, and with the use of large sprites, something had to give, resulting in less animation per character and an overall lack of detail. However, I want to be clear, I don't think the game looks bad, it's just that once you've played it for a short while, you'll realize that you've seen most of what there is to see, and then there's no small details that other games have that make things interesting, sometimes even make you go, oh, I've never noticed that before. If I had to call it a specific problem with the lack of detail, I'd think I'd go with the bosses, which just simply don't seem to be very impressive or original. I know with the historical context of the game, they're supposed to be just various other generals or military leaders of other dynasties that you're warring against, so maybe that's why they're somewhat plain? They do look different from standard enemies, a bit larger, and they have special attacks that they pull out occasionally, but still, compared to what you'd see in other beat 'em ups, they're definitely a bit lacking. In other games, when the bosses come out to play, there's usually an intensity behind the fight, with some of that coming from the bosses having a more intimidating look than regular enemies, not to mention different background music or combat styles, and that feeling just isn't conveyed here. The sound in the game is like the graphics, decent but nothing amazing, especially for a 1993 release. The cartridge clocks in at 16 megabits, for reference that's the same size as Streets of Rage 2, so theoretically there should be plenty of space for an FM soundtrack and sound effects. But if I'm being honest, I don't think there's anything here that's going to blow anyone's doors off. As far as the music goes specifically, the tunes and melodies used aren't bad, but the instrumentation and the samples they chose to actually play the songs aren't the best quality. The best thing I can say is that they did use different music for the levels and the boss fights, but even with that variety of different songs, the actual songs themselves can get repetitive after a bit. Unfortunately, the sound effects in the game come off even worse than the music. Like the music, none of the effects are specifically bad, but they definitely aren't anything impressive either. And there's not very many of them either, so expect to hear a lot of the same thuds when attacks land or enemies are knocked to the ground. Probably the best sound effects are the crashes when barrels are broken or you pick up an item, but honestly both of those sound like they were ripped off from other games. I just can't put my finger on where they pulled them from. At the end of the day, the gameplay, the graphics, the sound, they're all a bit lacking, especially when compared to something like Streets of Rage. From a gameplay perspective specifically, I'd say it's maybe patterned after something like The Simpsons. And personally, as much as I love that game, even I recognize that it's not the best beat 'em up in the world, and it gets by more on its humorous environments than actual gameplay, which Generals of the Yang family does not have. There are some nice touches here and there, like the still screens of the characters at the beginning, and screens with brief story between each of the levels, that honestly won't mean anything unless you're already familiar with the Generals of the Yang family folklore. But other than that, there's really not much else that goes on in the game to enhance the gameplay. It's essentially walk through a level, fight bad guys, change scenes for the boss fight, and then rinse and repeat, with the level backgrounds just appearing as somewhat generic Chinese scenes. As a result of the general okayness of Generals of the Yang family, I'm giving the game 2 stars. It's certainly not the worst game that Pico Interactive has brought back from the dead, but I think you'd really have to be a Genesis and beat 'em up fan to invest in this. And that's it for Generals of the Yang family Clan of Heroes. Ultimately, I think this was a solid idea for a video game, and it could have potentially been really cool, maybe something like Capcom's Warriors of Fate, but the execution just wasn't there. For an unlicensed Taiwanese title, it certainly could have been far worse, but for my money, if you're looking to mine the obscure portions of the Genesis library for beat-em-ups, I would stick with the previously reviewed water margin. Just pretend not to notice the borrowed assets from other titles. Next time on the channel, I'm reviewing a game that I've been looking forward to taking a look at since last year, when fan of the channel Dr. P helped me out with obtaining a copy of it, which was very much appreciated as it's one of the more sought after games in the European Master System library, due to it being a fairly late release on the console. So shout out to Dr. P, next week's video is thanks to him especially, and of course everyone else out there that has subscribed and supported the channel on the run up to that magical 1,000 subscriber mark. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 272. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.